welcome to the 16th lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century Anglophone novel as practiced by a select group of women writers. After a long and detailed study of Nella Larsen's passing, we have switched to the second writer, and I have begun to introduce the writer as a preface to going over the novel itself. The writer is Djuna Barnes, and the novel is Nightwood. I began discussing some key historical as well as literary and cultural events which happened on a parallel track alongside key moments in Djuna Barnes's life. I also tried to describe what major events took place in the history and the evolution of civil rights, and particularly as civil rights pertain to relations between same sex couples and legal reform on homosexuality. We had reached the third decade of the 20th century, and I mentioned how this was a key decade because it saw the publication of Nightwood in the year 1936 with significant support from T.S. Eliot. And I mentioned how it's worth reading the two short prefatory essays that T.S. Eliot wrote for different editions of Nightwood. T.S. Eliot's essays, especially the prefatory material that T.S. Eliot wrote for helping the publication of unknown figures, that kind of writing is a genre unto itself. And several scholars have written about the different kinds of implications of such writing. Scholars have also studied the different kinds of motivations that Eliot might have had in writing these prefatory essays. One thing is for certain that T.S. Eliot used his position as a very, very influential editor and writer in order to help writers from different backgrounds, non typical, non conventional backgrounds, sometimes writers from different countries, who were trying to break into the literary culture of London. And in this respect, one can say that T.S. Eliot was paying it forward. As a relatively unknown American immigrant, T.S. Eliot had benefited from the solidarity of strangers and the support of strangers. And in his own way, he paid it forward. Paying it forward in the case of Djuna Barnes must have taken much less effort than, say, paying it forward in the case of writers like Amos Tuttle or writers from the subcontinent, writers who were not even sometimes writing in English. So, that said, T.S. Eliot's preface to Nightwood is a very good record of his own reading, as well as a good testament to the fact that Eliot could become a champion of good writing wherever it came from and whoever might have been the author. So, I'll have occasion to talk a little bit about that preface, but for now, I just want to note that. Now, this time, the third decade, also saw the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, the Spanish Civil War, and a sort of movement towards building up towards the devastation of World War II. The writing of this time took on a darker and more political tone, and one can find it most obviously in the writing of the early Auden. Auden's early writing when he was a student at Oxford and deeply influenced by T.S. Eliot. That writing represents a very deep and searching exploration of the value of communism, Marxism, and socialist ways of thinking in early 20th century Europe. Similarly, writers like George Orwell, Jean-Paul Sartre, Samuel Beckett all brought very different but very powerful kinds of intellectual energies into the subject and the task of thinking about writing and how to think. What was the place of an intellectual in a world that was witnessing such unprecedented political change? Orwell's reportage, whether it was about the slums and the working class lives of England in Manchester and the soup kitchens where the workers of England used to go and have their meals, Whether it was about the Spanish Civil War, where Orwell went to fight, the book is Keep the Aspidistra Flying, or whether it was the novel Nausea by Jean Paul Sartre, which turned towards the philosophical exploration of existentialism at a time when great militaristic and technological changes, and changes which seemed inevitable and overwhelming to scholars. And at this time, Beckett also produced his extremely spare, minimalistic, and philosophical reflections and his theater of absurdity. So these are only some of the writers who are active, and one can see and correlate how the tone and the mode of exploration of this writing is very much in line with the gloomy turn that these times were taking. Now, in terms of the evolution of legislation on same sex relations, these relations remain criminalized, but Nightwood became kind of a milestone and a landmark text in the way it was able to explore kinds of desire which were criminalized in society. It is best seen as part of a tradition which was inaugurated by the Well of Loneliness. And I'll make a brief comment about that also later, about how the novel Nightwood takes a very different kind of tone to the same reality which other so called lesbian novels were straddling. The reality was the deep depression that such thoughts and such feelings could drive people into. And instead of writing a book which described those depressing conclusions and those failed and despairing ends into which such relations could be driven, Nightwood takes a different approach. It is a joyous and celebratory account. What exactly it celebrates is less clear, however, but it is very clear that it takes a celebratory approach to describing realities which otherwise presented quite despairing and depressive conclusions. Now, the next decade saw Barnes return to New York and live in Greenwich Village. This was a site which proved to be incredibly fertile for Barnes. It was a site that led to a lot of new friendships, new professional relationships, solidarities with editors, other writers began. In the personal sphere, new relationships began, relationships which would shape and inspire Barnes's writing. The Second World War ended and changed the global political scene. Devastation and the effects of Holocaust and the devastation of the war meant that Europe began to recede, and the traditional European powers began to be less and less powerful, and the US began to emerge as a global power. Existentialism and postmodernism began to raise their influence and began to make their influence felt in the literary and cultural production of this time. Now, in terms of civil rights and same sex relations, repression continued, and there was little sign of any optimism because the persecution of even suspected homosexuals continued from the era of fascist Europe. Now, the following decade saw some changes, but not much for the better. Barnes continued to live in near seclusion, occasionally revising Nightwood and corresponding with admirers. In fact, corresponding with admirers and replying to letters written by readers who had read Nightwood and who admired it was something that Barnes continued to do until the very end of her life. In fact, one can read several accounts by contemporary individuals, people born much later in the century, who stumbled onto Nightwood, who discovered it while browsing in a bookshop, or read it because a friend recommended, or just picked it up and happened to read it and felt deeply moved by it, and ended up writing a note of appreciation to Djuna Barnes. Barnes made it a point to reply to each of these letters, and there are several quite moving accounts that one can read, journalistic accounts, memoir like accounts, by admirers of Djuna Barnes who wrote to her and got replies in return. The 50s and the 60s were a decade when the McCarthyite persecution continued. Civil rights movements had begun to make their influence felt. They had not yet secured many of the landmark victories that they would be remembered for later, but their influence had begun to spread, and there was a change in the intellectual and cultural climate of the century across most of the US and the UK. In terms of the literature, confessional and beat poetry had begun to make itself known. Writers like Sylvia Plath, Allen Ginsberg had begun to get published and receive a great deal of critical acclaim. Organizations like the Lavender Scare had begun in the US and the UK, but organizations had also begun to get together in order to resist the negativity and the persecution of these very conservative movements. Organizations like the Mattakean Society in 1950 and Daughters of the Bilitis from 1955 began to build solidarity and, in some ways, realize and fulfill the transformative promise that a book like Nightwood was written with. So, even though Nightwood could not produce change in its own right, the sensibility that it was written without expecting any real change, without expecting that the individuals who were persecuted in Nightwood would find solidarity. Even though Nightwood did not create very strong hope, and it seemed to emerge from a place of despair, and it seemed to transform despair into joy. Even though all these things were the case, a few decades after Nightwood was written, and while Barnes was doing other things, revising, but also imagining and writing other kinds of projects, one of the biggest possible themes and the most momentous possible changes that Nightwood might have even dreamt of began to be slowly realized. So, this is the earliest possible beginnings, the seeds of solidarity and reform in the repression and heteronormativity that existed across such wide swathes of the modern world. The 1970s witnessed the consolidation of these movements. Homosexuality was decriminalized. It began in certain parts of the US. The Sexual Offences Act in 1967 in the UK was modified and reformed. And Barnes becomes, at this stage, at this point, Barnes is identified and anointed as part of a lesbian literary heritage. Now, this is not something that I will be discussing a great deal because I'm not very convinced about the intellectual value of using a very narrowly identity based description of a literary tradition like a lesbian literary heritage. It is a very useful description in many ways. In this course, however, I will be examining these literary texts primarily as textual artifacts and speculating less on what kind of identities might have created them and leaving the task of thinking about identity as something that emerges from the textual workings of these novels. So, whether or not Nightwood is an iconic and momentous text of the lesbian literary heritage, I will leave that for readers and scholars to decide. Any such discussion of what a lesbian literary heritage means must emerge from a dialogue that connects Nightwood to other texts, not just texts that are retrospectively identified as part of a lesbian literary heritage, but all literature. As we'll find out, Djuna Barnes was very much a child of the high modernist era. Like many other writers of the 20th century, including writers like Sylvia Plath, whose work has been received as if it exists in an opposition to the work of many canonical and male modernist writers. It has recently been discovered that these writers were actually very closely in dialogue with some of the modernist writers who are today seen as very problematic. So, for instance, while the most recent biographer of Sylvia Plath, Heather Clark, demonstrates in her book Red Comet, W.B. Yeats and T.S. Eliot were among Sylvia Plath's greatest literary heroes, and she remained in very close and very formative dialogue with the work of these writers throughout her literary career. So the point is not to say that whether some kinds of writers are more important or some traditions are more important than other traditions. Rather, it's to leave the question of identity as something which emerges from the writing instead of assuming that an identity can be used to understand the writing itself. Literary labor, the task of putting words on the page, the task of creating narratives by putting words together, is not just a professional or intellectual task, it is also a way of creating selves, fashioning selves, defining one's identity, choosing from multiple possible inheritances. And that process is very unique and it must be explored by readers who pay attention to the words on the page. So, the question of Djuna Barnes's location at the beginning or at a high point of a lesbian literary heritage is something that I will not be too interested in at this early stage. After discussing the novel, I may reflect on that question, but even then, I will not do that at a great length. Now, the 70s were an important decade because this was a decade when second wave feminism reinforced other sorts of liberal and liberation based movements. Stonewall took place in the very end of this debate. Stonewall is a very, very important event. It turned the tide in the history of 20th century homophobia. It was a bar in California which refused, or people at this bar refused to accept the usual persecution that was taking place, and it led to a resistance and a riot which changed the course of legislation as well as identity and social life for individuals who had been persecuted, seen as abnormal, inverts, or other kinds of derogatory terms earlier. So, Stonewall was a very, very important event, and it makes the 1970s a very iconic and memorable decade. In terms of literary and intellectual production, feminist literary criticism began to make some very powerful interventions, and the work of modernists like Gertrude Stein, Mina Loy, H.D. began to be studied, discussed almost as on par with the work of their male and more famous counterparts, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Yeats, and so on. So, a very important decade, something that was unthinkable in the time that Nightwood was composed. 1982 is when Djuna Barnes passes away in Greenwich Village at age 19. And this is the later stages of the Cold War. The times were extremely conservative. The political regime was that of Reagan and Thatcher era conservatism. In terms of literary production, writers who were beginning to be recognized and rising in literary acclaim were Salman Rushdie, Angela Carter, Jeanette Winterson, and themes such as postmodernism were becoming more and more accepted. I will have occasion to read from Jeanette Winterson's writing about Nightwood very shortly. So it's important to note that Winterson was a writer who, in the 80s, was beginning to find their feet as a serious practitioner of the literary art. The 1980s were also a time when the AIDS crisis was beginning, and it brought renewed urgency in queer activism and the remembrance of earlier generations. The remembrance of earlier generations is an important tendency and an important historical move. It has been discussed in great detail by several contemporary scholars, the most influential and memorable of whom might be Heather Love, who's written a book called Feeling Backwards. And this is part of a move made by several scholars in which some of the jubilation and the joy of post Stonewall era, which can be described as pride. Some of that pride was tinged with a lot of disappointment and nostalgia about the earlier waves of resistance. There were generations of queer artists and activists who had not had the privileges and the comfort of queer activists in the post Stonewall era. And so in the 80s and the 90s, in the wake of the AIDS crisis, it became very poignant and it served as a poignant reminder of the struggles and the sacrifices that had to be made in order for the present comfort or the privilege of pride to become possible in the first place. So there was a attempt made by scholars to reckon not just with pride but also with shame, and this happened because the AIDS crisis began to exert its interpretive influence over a lot of other spheres of academic life. Now, before I go further and read from some contextual information, I want to read from a very powerful document, which is the introductory essay by Jeanette Winterson to the 2007 Faber and Faber edition of Nightwood. This edition comes with three short prose pieces. The first is an introduction by Jeanette Winterson. I think it's the longest of all three. The second is another prose piece called The Preface, and this is by T.S. Eliot, first published in the year 1937. And this was a preface to the first English edition of Nightwood. Eliot had earlier written another very short preface, just two paragraphs, to the British edition of Nightwood. So all these three prefatory materials are included in the Faber and Faber edition. Now, I want to spend some time with Jeanette Winterson's introduction because it places the reader, in my view, the most appropriate headspace or the most appropriate intellectual and emotional disposition, a state of mind in which they are likely to receive the contents of Nightwood in a way that would prove to be the most meaningful to them. So there's a paragraph on the first page where Jeanette Winterson writes, Nightwood is itself. It is its own created world, exotic and strange, and reading it is like drinking wine with a pearl dissolving in the glass. You have taken in more than you know, and it will go on doing its work. From now on, a part of you is pearl lined. So it's almost a strange and a bewildering statement to make. But if we can take the metaphor and not be too worried about it from a gastroenterical perspective, it can be a bit frightening thought that what if someone drinks wine and there's a pearl dissolved in it, it can cause some serious health problems. That's not the point. If one can ignore that very quickly and try and think about what Winterson is trying to say about the experience of reading Nightwood. And the comment or the point that Winterson is trying to make, I think, is about how should one read this novel. And the statement is trying to prevent the reader from taking certain approaches which may not be the most profitable. The first approach, which the reader might be willing to take and which, in Winterson's view, is not very profitable, is that of looking for meaning, looking for a satisfactory explanation of what is going on, why we should read about it, and why we should care about these events. This is one of the things that most readers are likely to be most exasperated by. And this is the first warning that Winterson gives to readers. Don't look for meaning in the way you might be used to looking for meaning in typical ways. Just consume the text, inhale the text. Inhale is a word that I've been encountering that's been used as a way to describe certain texts. I came across an instance on social media in which a user wrote that they inhaled Heather Clark's new biography of Sylvia Plath. It's a way of saying that they read it very quickly because they enjoyed it so much. But here, I think this statement by Jeanette Winterson that reading Nightwood is like drinking wine with a pearl dissolved in it, it takes the idea of inhaling a narrative to its logical but also sometimes frightening conclusion. What would it really mean? What would it truly mean to consume a text without worrying too much about what it means? And Winterson's point is That is the kind of openness, that is the kind of risk, and that is the kind of adventure that one needs to be open to. In fact, it's a requirement, it's not an option. If one does not approach Nightwood with that sense of taking a risk, jumping into an unknown adventure, without knowing what that adventure will do, whether it will help us, whether it will improve us, or whether it will take us into a totally unknown direction, that is a requirement. And I will read a couple of more passages from this introduction before going on to the text, but I'll do that in the next lecture since we are at time for this one. Thank you.